The wolf stood taller than any horse Samuel had ever broken. Its fur shimmered like moonlight caught in morning frost, translucent enough that he could see the pines behind it through its massive chest. The beast's jaws hung open, revealing teeth the size of his fingers, and from its throat came a sound that wasn't quite a howl, more like the wind screaming through a canyon at midnight. The creature wasn't attacking. That's what froze Samuel's blood colder than the October air. It was standing between the pregnant woman and something else. The woman, Mary Hutchins from the Henderson Ranch, pressed both hands against her swollen belly, her face drained white as creek ice. She wasn't running. She was staring past the wolf, past Samuel, toward the tree line. When Samuel finally followed her gaze and saw what stood in the shadows beneath those pines, his rifle slipped from his trembling hands and hit the frozen ground. The wolf roared again, desperate, pleading. And Samuel understood. God help him, he finally understood. But his legs wouldn't move. Not anymore. What I'm about to tell you today will make you question everything you thought you knew about the wild places. But first, tell me, where are you listening from? I love knowing which corner of this great country you're joining me from today. Drop it in the comments below. 3 days before that frozen morning, Samuel Crow had been mending fence posts on the eastern boundary of his land when he first heard the stories. Old Thomas Whitfield, who'd ranched these mountains for 40 years, rode up on his gray mare and dismounted without greeting. The old man's face carried the kind of worry that doesn't wash off with creek water. He tied his horse to Samuel's fence and stood there, rolling a cigarette with fingers that shook just enough to notice. Samuel had known Thomas since he was a boy, and the old rancher wasn't the type to ride 5 miles just to pass the time. "Lost 3 calves last week," Thomas said, striking a match against his belt buckle. The flame danced between them as he lit the cigarette and took a long pull. "Found 'em scattered across the north pasture, throats torn but not eaten." He exhaled smoke that hung in the cold air like a ghost. "Something's wrong up in those mountains, Samuel. Wrong in a way I ain't never seen." Samuel leaned against his fence post and wiped the sweat from his forehead, despite the autumn chill. Thomas described tracks he'd found near the dead calves. Paw prints larger than any wolf or bear he'd ever tracked, pressed so deep into the earth it looked like the creature weighed as much as a full-grown bull. But here's what made Thomas's voice drop to almost a whisper. The tracks appeared and disappeared without reason, as if whatever made them could walk through solid rock. "My boy Jake followed them for half a mile," Thomas said, flicking ash onto the frozen ground. "Said they led straight to Widow's Peak, then just stopped, middle of a clearing. No trace after that." Samuel had heard stories about Widow's Peak since childhood. The Ute people who'd lived in these mountains before the settlers came had names for that place. Names that translated roughly to "where the dead walk" or "the breathing mountain." His own father had forbidden him from hunting anywhere near that granite outcrop that jutted from the mountainside like a broken tooth. "Old superstitions," his father would say, but then he'd add, "but some superstitions got teeth." Samuel had always figured it was just talk, the kind of stories men tell to keep their children close to home. "Henderson's pregnant daughter is staying up at their line cabin," Thomas said, and now his eyes met Samuel's directly. "Mary, you know her, rode horses with your sister before she married that freight driver from Denver." Samuel nodded. He remembered Mary Henderson as a girl who could rope a calf faster than most men and wasn't afraid of hard work. "Her husband's gone to Denver for supplies, won't be back for another week," Thomas continued. "That cabin sits right at the base of Widow's Peak." He let that information settle between them like snow accumulating on a roof. Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the October wind cutting across his land. The Henderson line cabin was isolated, a good hour's ride from the main ranch house. Mary would be 8 months pregnant by now, maybe more. "Someone should ride up there," Samuel said, already knowing what Thomas would say next. The old man nodded and crushed his cigarette under his boot heel. "Figured you'd say that. Jim Henderson's laid up with a broken leg from a fall last Tuesday. His sons are moving cattle down from the high country. I got my own hands full and—" He paused. "I'm too old to be chasing ghosts in the mountains." That evening, Samuel told his wife Clara about his intention to ride up to check on Mary Henderson. Clara stood at their kitchen stove, stirring a pot of stew, her back straight and tense in the way it got when she was trying not to say what she was thinking. They'd been married 11 years, and Samuel had learned to read the language of her silences. "It's just a welfare check," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "I'll ride up tomorrow morning, make sure she's got enough firewood and supplies, and be back before supper." Clara set down her wooden spoon and turned to face him. She was a practical woman, daughter of a blacksmith, raised to face hard truths without flinching. "Thomas Whitfield doesn't ride 5 miles to chat about dead calves," she said, "and you don't volunteer for a 6-hour round-trip ride for a welfare check." She wiped her hands on her apron, flour dusting off in small clouds. What did he really tell you? Samuel hesitated, then told her everything. The tracks, the way they disappeared, the stories about Widow's Peak. Clara listened without interrupting, her gray eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she walked to the window and looked out at the mountains to the east, where the peaks were turning purple in the fading light. "My grandmother was Arapaho," she said quietly. Samuel knew this, but Clara rarely spoke about her grandmother. "She told me stories about spirit animals, guardians that walked between this world and the next. Said they only appeared when something was breaking through that shouldn't." She turned back to him. "Said when you see one, you listen, because they're trying to warn you about something worse." The hair on Samuel's arm stood up despite the warm kitchen. He rode out at first light the next morning. The trail to the Henderson Line cabin wound through pine forests that grew thicker as the elevation increased. Samuel knew these mountains well enough to travel them blind, had hunted elk and deer through these same trees since he was 12 years old. But this morning, something felt different. The forest was too quiet. No birds called from the branches. No squirrels chattered warnings at his passing. Even his horse, a steady buckskin gelding named Rusty, twitched his ears constantly and fought the bit, wanting to turn back. About halfway to the cabin, Samuel found the first sign that Thomas hadn't been exaggerating. A massive paw print pressed into the soft earth beside a stream, so fresh that water was still seeping into the depression. Samuel dismounted and knelt beside it, placing his hand in the print for scale. His entire hand, fingers spread wide, covered less than half the track. The print showed 4 toes and claw marks that had gouged the earth like knife strikes. But what made Samuel's breath catch was the lack of weight distribution. A normal animal's print shows deeper impressions at certain points, where bones and muscle create pressure. This print was uniformly deep, as if whatever made it had no bones at all. He looked around the clearing, hand resting on the rifle strapped to his saddle. The stream burbled over rocks, indifferent to his presence. Pine needles carpeted the ground, undisturbed except for that single impossible track. No trail leading to it, no trail leading away. Just one print, as if something enormous had materialized at this exact spot, pressed down with terrible weight, then vanished. Samuel's rational mind tried to find explanations. A trick of the light, a collapsed animal burrow, erosion from the stream. But his gut, trained by 20 years of reading wilderness signs, knew better. He remounted and continued up the trail, but now his rifle lay across his saddle, one hand always near the stock. The trees seemed to press closer, their shadows deeper despite the morning sun. Twice Rusty stopped and refused to move forward, ears pinned back, until Samuel had to use his spurs. The horse's fear was contagious. Samuel found himself checking over his shoulder every few minutes, studying the forest behind him for movement that never came. The silence felt alive, watchful, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The Henderson Line cabin appeared around a bend in the trail just before noon. It was a solid structure, built from pine logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney from which a thin line of smoke rose into the clear air. Samuel felt relief flood through him at that smoke. It meant Mary was there, alive, tending her fire. He called out as he approached, the way you do in the wilderness to avoid startling someone who might have a rifle pointed at unexpected visitors. "Mary Henderson, it's Samuel Crow, Clara's husband, coming in friendly." The cabin door opened and Mary appeared in the doorway. She was heavily pregnant, her belly prominent under a wool dress that had probably fit better a month ago. But it was her face that stopped Samuel mid-dismount. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her skin had the pale, drawn look of someone fighting constant fear. She held a shotgun, not aimed at him exactly, but not pointed at the ground either. "Mr. Crow," she said, and her voice cracked on his name. "Thank God. Thank God someone came. Samuel tied Rusty to the hitching post and approached slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. Your father's laid up with a broken leg. Asked me to ride up and check on you. It was a small lie, but one that gave her father dignity. How are you managing up here? Mary lowered the shotgun and stepped back into the cabin, gesturing for him to enter. The interior was neat, well-maintained, but Samuel noticed immediately that she'd nailed boards across the two windows, leaving only small gaps to see through. The door had fresh scratches around the frame, as if she'd reinforced it recently. Something's been circling the cabin, Mary said, setting the shotgun within easy reach beside the door. She moved to the fireplace and used a poker to adjust the burning logs, even though the fire needed no adjustment. 3 nights now. I hear it after dark, moving around outside. Heavy footsteps, but not like a bear. Not like anything I've ever heard. She turned to face him, and Samuel saw real terror in her eyes. Last night it scratched at the door, not clawing like an animal trying to get in, scratching, like it was testing, seeing how strong the wood was. Samuel felt his chest tighten. He walked to one of the boarded windows and peered through a gap. The clearing around the cabin was empty, peaceful in the afternoon sun. Beyond the clearing, the forest stood thick and dark, and somewhere above those trees, Widow's Peak rose like a stone monument. Did you see it? He asked, still watching the tree line. Mary came to stand beside him, one hand resting on her swollen belly in that unconscious way pregnant women do. No, it stays in the shadows, but I can feel it watching. Even now in daylight, it's out there. She told him about the first night she'd heard it. She'd been reading by the fire, her husband gone only 2 days, when a sound came from outside that made her blood freeze. Not a howl, she said, but a cry. Almost human, but wrong. Like someone trying to imitate human speech without understanding how a throat should shape the sounds. It had circled the cabin slowly, and she'd blown out her lamp and sat in darkness, shotgun across her knees, listening to footsteps that shouldn't be that heavy moving around her home. When dawn came, I went outside, she said. Found tracks all around the cabin, big as dinner plates. Samuel noticed a small leather journal on the table, open to a page covered in Mary's neat handwriting. He recognized it as the kind of diary women kept, recording daily life, weather, thoughts. But the visible page held only one sentence, written over and over in increasingly shaky script. It wants something from me. Mary saw him looking and closed the journal quickly. I've been praying, she said. Praying and writing down everything I remember. My grandmother used to say that spirits can't touch you if you remember who you are, where you come from. Keep your identity strong. I'm taking you down to your father's ranch, Samuel said. Decision made. Pack what you need. We'll leave within the hour. But Mary shook her head, and he saw stubbornness join the fear in her expression. I can't ride a horse, not this pregnant. The jolting could bring on labor early, and I'm not due for another 3 weeks. She placed both hands on her belly, protective. Dr. Morrison said I need to stay off horses, and the wagon trail is washed out from the storms last week. There's no safe way down except on foot, and I can't walk that far. Samuel knew she was right. The trail they'd need to take was barely wide enough for a single horse, winding through rocky terrain that would be treacherous for a pregnant woman. A fall could kill both her and the baby. Then I'm staying here, he said. Tonight. Whatever's out there, it'll have to go through me to get to you. Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. My husband will be back in 4 days. If I can just hold until then. She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew 4 days was a long time when something was hunting you. The afternoon passed slowly. Samuel checked and rechecked his rifle, cleaned and loaded his revolver, and inspected the cabin's defenses. The walls were solid, the door strong. He reinforced it with a thick beam Mary had been using as a bench, creating a bar that would hold against anything short of an axe. He checked the boards on the windows, finding them secure. Through the gaps he studied the forest, looking for movement, for any sign of the creature Mary described. But the woods remained still, almost unnaturally so. No deer emerged to graze. No birds flew between the trees. It was as if every living thing had abandoned this part of the mountain. Mary prepared a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, moving around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency despite her pregnancy. Samuel noticed she never turned her back to the door for more than a few seconds. She'd place a pot on the stove, then glance at the door, stir the beans, then check the door again. It was the behavior of prey, he realized, something that knows it's being stalked. "Talk to me about something normal," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "Tell me about Clara, your ranch, anything that feels like the world still makes sense." So Samuel told her about his cattle, about the new bull he'd bought from a breeder in Montana, about Clara's garden and how she'd managed to grow tomatoes despite the early frost. He talked about his plans to build a new barn next spring, about his sister's children learning to ride. Mary listened hungrily, asking questions, clinging to these mundane details like lifelines connecting her to normalcy. For a little while, the cabin felt almost safe, almost like just another mountain homestead where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. But as the sun began its descent toward the peaks, both of them felt the mood change. Darkness came early in the mountains, shadows pooling in the valley like water filling a well. Samuel lit 2 oil lamps and placed them where their light would reach the corners of the cabin, eliminating hiding places. He loaded the shotgun and set it beside the door, positioned his rifle within arm's reach of the chair where he'd spend the night. Mary sat on her bed, a blanket around her shoulders, watching him prepare. "It comes about 2 hours after full dark," she said quietly. "That's when I hear it the first time. The scratching doesn't start until midnight." They waited. Samuel sat in the wooden chair facing the door, rifle across his lap. Mary lay on her bed, but he could tell from her breathing that she wasn't sleeping. Outside, the wind picked up, making the pines sigh and sway. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Samuel had spent enough nights in mountain cabins to know the difference between wind and something else. He kept his breathing steady, his eyes on the door, and waited for whatever would come. The fire crackled. The lamps flickered. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin walls, something began to move. The first sound came exactly when Mary said it would. Not a howl, not a growl, but that wrong, almost human cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Samuel felt every muscle in his body tense. Rusty, tied outside, screamed. Not a horse's whinny, but a scream of pure terror. Then came the sound of the hitching post splintering and hooves thundering away into the night. Samuel cursed under his breath. Now they were trapped here, no way to ride for help. Mary sat up on her bed, both hands pressed against her mouth, eyes wide in the lamplight. Footsteps circled the cabin, heavy, deliberate, the sound of something massive moving with terrible purpose. Samuel moved to the window and peered through the gap between boards. The moon had risen, 3/4 full, casting silver light across the clearing. And there, at the edge of the forest, he saw it. The wolf was enormous, standing as tall at the shoulder as a horse's back. But it wasn't the size that made Samuel's hands shake. It was the way moonlight passed through the creature's body, making it shimmer like heat waves rising from summer earth. The wolf turned its massive head, and Samuel found himself staring into eyes that glowed with their own pale light. Then the scratching began. Long, deliberate scrapes against the door, as if testing its strength. Not frantic, not aggressive, but methodical. Curious. Mary had been right. This wasn't an animal trying to break in. This was something intelligent. Something that understood doors and barriers and was evaluating them. Samuel raised his rifle and aimed at the door, finger on the trigger, waiting. The scratching stopped. Silence fell, so complete that Samuel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then came 3 soft thuds against the door. Not scratches, knocks. Something with intelligence. Something that understood human customs. Something that was asking permission to enter. Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire. Something in his gut told him that shooting through the door would be the worst mistake he could make. The knocking came again, 3 measured thuds that shook dust from the door frame. Behind him, Mary whispered something he couldn't quite hear. A prayer maybe, or words in a language he didn't know. The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, their breath visible in plumes despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Samuel felt sweat freeze on his temples. The wolf made that wrong, almost human sound again, and this time Samuel heard something in it he hadn't noticed before. Desperation. "Don't shoot it," Mary said, her voice barely audible. Samuel risked a glance back at her. She'd risen from the bed and stood with both hands pressed against her belly, her face pale but strangely calm. "I know this sounds insane, but don't shoot it. I don't think it wants to hurt us." Samuel stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Mary, that thing out there is the size of a grizzly bear, and it's not natural. It chased your horse into the night." But Mary shook her head, cutting him off. "Rusty was terrified, but he wasn't injured. I heard him run off. If that creature wanted to kill him, Rusty would be dead." The footsteps moved away from the door, circling the cabin again. Samuel tracked the sound, moving from window to window, peering through the gaps in the boards. Each time he caught a glimpse of the creature, it seemed to shimmer and fade, more ghost than flesh. But the tracks it left in the earth were real enough. He could see them in the moonlight, pressed deep into the ground. "For 3 nights it's been here," Mary continued, speaking faster now, as if words were a dam breaking. 3 nights it could have broken down this door, these walls. But it hasn't. It just circles. It watches. It waits. Samuel's mind raced, trying to make sense of something that defied sense. He'd been raised on rational thought, on cause and effect, on the solid reality of cattle and land and weather. But his wife's grandmother's words echoed in his head. Spirit animals only appear when something is breaking through that shouldn't. "What does it want?" he asked, not expecting an answer. Mary moved to the table and picked up her journal, the one he'd seen earlier. She opened it to a page near the end and held it out to him. "I think it's trying to warn me, protect me from something, but I don't know what." Samuel took the journal and read by lamplight. Mary's handwriting covered the pages, sometimes neat and controlled, sometimes shaky and desperate. She'd documented every night the wolf appeared, noting times, sounds, behaviors. But interspersed with these observations were other things. Dreams she'd had, feelings she couldn't explain. One passage made Samuel's blood cold. "I dream of something in the earth beneath Widow's Peak, something old and hungry that's been sleeping but is waking up. In the dream I see myself walking toward it, and I can't stop. My body moves, but my mind screams. And the wolf is behind me, trying to pull me back." He looked up at Mary. "These dreams, when did they start?" She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young and very frightened. "The day after Jacob left for Denver. I thought it was just pregnancy fears. You know how women get strange thoughts when they're carrying. But they've gotten stronger, more real. Last night I woke up and my feet were dirty, like I'd been walking outside, but the door was still barred from the inside." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice trembled. "Mr. Crow, I think something is calling me, and I think that wolf is the only thing stopping me from answering." The scratching came again, but this time at the back wall, near the window that faced Widow's Peak. Samuel moved quickly, peering through the gap. The wolf stood just outside, its massive head turned not toward the cabin but toward the mountain. Its mouth opened in that eerie, almost human cry, and Samuel realized with a start that it sounded like a warning, like someone shouting a danger they couldn't put into words. The wolf's ears lay flat against its skull, and its translucent body seemed to flicker, growing more solid and then fading again, as if it was struggling to maintain its presence in this world. Then Samuel saw what the wolf was looking at. Higher up the mountain, visible in the moonlight, something moved along the bare rock face of Widow's Peak. At first he thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light. But shadows don't move against the wind. Shadows don't pulse with a rhythm like breathing. The thing on the mountain was massive, dark as a starless night, and it seemed to flow down the rock face like oil poured from a bucket. Samuel's rational mind tried to name it. A rock slide, maybe, or a large animal. But his gut knew better. This was what the wolf was warning them about. "Mary," Samuel said, his voice tight. "Come here, slowly. Don't make any sudden movements." She crossed the cabin and looked through the gap beside him. He heard her breath catch, felt her body go rigid. "Oh God," she whispered. "That's what I see in my dreams. That's what's been calling me." The dark thing on the mountain seemed to sense their attention. It stopped its downward flow and turned, though it had no visible head or face, toward the cabin. Samuel felt the weight of its attention like physical pressure against his chest. His lungs struggled to draw air. The wolf roared again, and this time there was no mistaking the fury in the sound. It launched itself away from the cabin, racing across the clearing toward the forest, toward the base of Widow's Peak. Samuel watched, stunned, as the creature ran straight at the mountain, its transparent form growing brighter, more solid with each stride. The dark thing on the rock face responded, flowing faster now, descending to meet the wolf's challenge. "It's protecting us," Mary breathed. "It's fighting that thing. For us." Samuel couldn't argue. Everything he was seeing defied everything he knew, but the evidence was right there in front of him. The wolf reached the tree line and disappeared into the shadows. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the forest erupted with sounds, crashing, breaking, that terrible, almost human cry mixing with something else. A sound like stone grinding against stone, like the earth itself groaning in pain. Trees swayed and fell. The ground beneath the cabin shuddered. Mary grabbed Samuel's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "We have to help it," she said. Samuel turned to stare at her. "Help it? Mary, we don't even know what it is." But she was already moving toward the door, reaching for the bar that held it shut. "No!" Samuel lunged and caught her wrist. "You can't go out there. You don't know what—" Mary spun on him, and her eyes held something wild, something that wasn't quite her anymore. "It's dying for me. For my baby, I can feel it. That thing on the mountain, it wants my child. It's been calling to me for days, trying to draw me out. And the wolf is the only reason I'm still here. The only reason I haven't walked out into the night and straight to that cursed peak." Tears ran down her face, but her voice was steady. "I won't let it die alone." Samuel held her gaze, saw the determination there, the mother's fierce instinct to protect her unborn child. He made a decision that Clara would probably curse him for, if he lived long enough to tell her. "We go together. You stay behind me. And if I tell you to run back here, you run, understand?" Mary nodded. Samuel removed the bar from the door, took a deep breath that tasted of fear and resignation, and pulled the door open. The October night air hit them, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something ancient and rotten, like earth from a long-sealed grave. The clearing was empty, but the sounds from the forest were getting louder, more violent. Samuel stepped out first, rifle ready, scanning for threats. Mary followed close behind, one hand on his shoulder, the other cradling her belly. They moved across the clearing toward the tree line, their boots crunching on frost-stiffened grass. The moon painted everything in silver and shadow. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the impossible battle being waged below. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs, each beat asking the same question. "What are you doing? What are you doing?" They reached the edge of the forest and stopped. 20 yards ahead, in a small clearing between pines, they saw it. The wolf stood its ground against something that Samuel's eyes refused to fully comprehend. The dark thing from the mountain had taken a shape now, or maybe it had always had this shape and Samuel just hadn't been able to see it clearly. It looked vaguely human, but stretched and wrong, as if someone had taken a man's shadow and given it three-dimensional form and malevolent purpose. It towered over the wolf, easily 15 feet tall, with arms that ended in hands with too many fingers. The wolf's transparent body glowed now, bright as moonlight, solid as stone. It lunged and snapped, driving the shadow thing back step by step. But Samuel could see the wolf was weakening. Its glow flickered. Its movements grew slower. Each time the shadow thing struck back and its blows moved like whips, like black lightning, the wolf's light dimmed a little more. Mary made a sound deep in her throat, something between a sob and a moan. "It's dying. We have to do something." Samuel raised his rifle, aimed at the shadow thing, and fired. The bullet passed straight through the creature as if it were smoke, but the shadow thing turned its attention toward them, and Samuel felt the full weight of its hunger. It wanted Mary. More specifically, it wanted what Mary carried. Samuel could feel that desire radiating from the thing like heat from a forge. This creature fed on potential, on futures that hadn't yet happened, on the life force of things not yet born. It had been sleeping under Widow's Peak for decades, maybe centuries, until Mary's pregnancy had called it forth like a dinner bell ringing. "It's been feeding on women who came too close to the mountain," Mary said, her voice distant, as if she was reading from a script written in her mind. "For generations, the Ute people knew. That's why they warned against this place. Every few decades, When a pregnant woman stays too long near Widow's Peak, it wakes up. It calls them, makes them walk out into the night, takes the baby's life force before it can be born. She swayed on her feet, and Samuel caught her elbow. "How do you know this?" he demanded. Mary's eyes were unfocused, seeing something beyond the present moment. "The wolf is showing me." It was one of the first. A woman's guardian animal, trying to protect her from this thing. It failed then. She walked to the peak and never came back. But her spirit, her protective instinct stayed. Became this. The shadow thing moved toward them, the wolf struggling to intercept it. Samuel fired again, uselessly, then threw the rifle aside and pulled his revolver. Mary stepped around him, moving in front of him, and raised both hands. "Stop," she said, her voice clear and strong. The shadow thing paused. "You can't have my child. You can't have me. I know what you are now, and I reject you." The creature made a sound like wind through a broken window, mocking, dismissive. It reached toward Mary with one elongated hand, fingers stretching impossibly long. The wolf threw itself between them, snapping at those terrible fingers. Its jaws closed on shadow flesh, and this time, miraculously, they held. The creature screamed, a sound that made Samuel's teeth ache and his vision blur. The wolf shook its massive head, tearing at the shadow thing, and where its teeth bit, light spread through the darkness like cracks in black ice. Mary dropped to her knees, gasping. "It's pulling life from me anyway, even from here. I can feel it draining my baby's strength." Her face was bone white, her lips blue. Samuel did the only thing he could think of. He holstered his useless revolver, pulled his hunting knife, and cut his left palm open. Blood welled up, black in the moonlight. Clara's grandmother had told stories about blood magic, about how life freely given could strengthen protective spirits. He had no idea if it would work, but he had to try something. He stepped forward and grabbed the wolf's shoulder. The moment his bleeding hand touched that translucent fur, he felt connection snap into place like a key turning in a lock. His blood, his life force, flowed into the wolf, and the creature blazed with renewed light. The wolf released the shadow thing and turned its great head to look at Samuel. In those glowing eyes, Samuel saw intelligence, gratitude, and ancient sorrow. Then the wolf spun back to the creature and attacked with renewed fury. Samuel felt his strength draining away through the connection, his knees going weak, but he held on. The wolf drove the shadow thing back, step by step, its jaws tearing great chunks of darkness away. Each piece that fell dissolved into mist when it hit the ground. The creature was shrieking continuously now, that wind through broken glass sound rising to a pitch that made blood run from Samuel's nose. Mary pulled herself upright, using a tree trunk for support. "The peak," she gasped. "Drive it back to Widow's Peak. It can be sealed there. That's where it came from." The wolf seemed to understand. It stopped tearing at the creature and instead began herding it, driving it back toward the mountain. The shadow thing fought, lashing out with those whip-like arms, but it was weakening. Where Samuel's blood had strengthened the wolf's attacks were destroying the shadow thing's cohesion. It was coming apart, losing its shape, becoming less solid with each passing moment. Samuel felt his consciousness starting to fade. He'd given too much blood, too much life force. His vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from the edges, but he held on to the wolf's shoulder, feeding it everything he had. If he died here, at least Mary and her baby would live. That was worth any price. He thought of Clara, hoped she'd understand, hoped she'd forgive him for not coming home. The ground tilted under his feet. His knees buckled. He started to fall. Then Mary was there, catching him, holding him up with surprising strength for a woman 8 months pregnant. "Not yet," she said fiercely in his ear. "You don't get to die yet. Your wife needs you. I need you to witness what happens next." She pressed her own hand against his bleeding palm, and Samuel felt a different kind of strength flow into him, not replacing what he'd lost, but sustaining him, keeping him conscious. Together they watched the wolf drive the shadow thing back through the forest, toward the bare stone face of Widow's Peak. The creature fought every step, but it was losing. The wolf's jaws had torn too much away. The shadow thing was half its original size now, its screams growing weaker, more desperate. They reached the base of Widow's Peak, where bare granite rose straight up toward the stars. The wolf gave one final lunge, its jaws closing around the center mass of the shadow thing's form. Then, in a motion too fast for Samuel's fading vision to follow, the wolf dragged the creature straight into the rock face. Not around it, not over it, into it. Both of them disappeared into solid stone as if it were water. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then light exploded from the mountain. It burst from every crack, every crevice, turning Widow's Peak into a beacon that must have been visible for 50 miles. The light was pure, white, cleansing. Samuel heard the shadow thing's final scream, cut off abruptly, as if a door had been slammed shut. The light faded slowly, gradually, until only the moon and stars remained. Widow's Peak stood silent and dark. The forest around them was utterly still. Even the wind had stopped. Samuel collapsed, Mary barely managing to lower him to the ground rather than letting him fall. She knelt beside him, pressing her hand against his wounded palm to stop the bleeding. "It's done," she said, tears streaming down her face. "They're both gone, sealed back in the mountain. The wolf gave everything to trap it there." Samuel's vision was blurry, but he could see the grief on her face. "It saved us," he managed to whisper. "Saved your baby." Mary nodded, sobbing openly now. "It was a mother. I saw its memories at the end. A mother who lost her child to that thing centuries ago, and she's been fighting it ever since, waiting for the right moment to seal it away forever." They sat there in the darkness, a cowboy who'd given too much blood, and a pregnant woman who'd almost lost everything, while the mountain above them stood guard over an ancient evil that would trouble the world no more. Samuel's hand had stopped bleeding, clotted by the cold or by something else, some last gift from the wolf spirit. He could feel his strength slowly returning, though he knew he'd be weak for days. "We should get back to the cabin," Mary said, helping him stand. "You need warmth and rest, and I need to write all of this down while I remember it clearly." They made their way back through the forest, Samuel leaning heavily on Mary despite her pregnancy. The cabin looked warm and welcoming now, lamplight spilling from gaps in the boarded windows. The threat was gone. The sense of being watched, being hunted, had vanished with the wolf and the shadow thing. When they reached the door, Samuel paused and looked back at Widow's Peak. The mountain was just a mountain now, granite and pine, beautiful and indifferent. But Samuel knew he'd never look at it the same way again. He'd seen what slept beneath its stone, and he'd seen what had died to keep it there. Inside the cabin, Mary helped Samuel into the chair and bandaged his hand with strips torn from clean cloth. She made coffee, strong and black, and they sat in silence for a long time, both processing what they'd witnessed. The fire crackled. The lamps burned steadily. Outside, in the darkness, Samuel heard an owl hoot, the first normal forest sound he'd heard in hours. Life was returning to the mountain. "No one will believe us," Mary said finally. Samuel sipped his coffee and nodded. "Probably not, but we know, and we'll remember." As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Samuel heard hoofbeats approaching. He rose stiffly and looked through a gap in the boards. Rusty was trotting toward the cabin, reins dragging, looking tired but unharmed. The horse had circled back. His panic faded with the shadow thing's defeat. "My ride home," Samuel said with relief. He could return to Clara, tell her, what? The truth? She'd believe him, he thought. She'd understand. Her grandmother's blood ran in her veins. She knew the old stories were real. Mary made breakfast while Samuel gathered his things. Neither of them spoke much. What was there to say? They'd survived something that shouldn't exist, saved by something equally impossible. As Samuel prepared to leave, Mary stopped him at the door and hugged him fiercely. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for staying, for giving your blood, for believing." Samuel hugged her back, careful of her belly. "Take care of that baby. The wolf died so it could live. Don't let that sacrifice be for nothing." Mary nodded against his chest. "I'll name her Hope. If it's a girl, Hope Clara, after your wife who married a man brave enough to fight shadows." Samuel rode down the mountain as the sun cleared the peaks, painting the world in gold and amber. His left hand throbbed. His body felt hollowed out, but he was alive. He'd witnessed something beyond understanding, touched something ancient and powerful, and survived. The trail wound through forest that seemed brighter now, more alive. Birds sang in the branches. A deer paused to watch him pass, unafraid. The shadow was gone, And the mountain could be a mountain again, just another part of the wild country, just another peak in a range of peaks. Nothing special, nothing cursed. But Samuel knew different. He'd carry the memory of that ghost wolf for the rest of his life. The way it had fought, the way it had sacrificed itself, the terrible love in its glowing eyes. A mother's love, transformed by death and loss into something that could fight the darkness. He thought about Mary's baby, due in 3 weeks, who would grow up never knowing how close she'd come to being consumed by something ancient and evil. Maybe that was for the best. Maybe some truths were too heavy for children to carry. When he finally rode into his own yard, the sun was high and Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. She turned at the sound of hooves, and her face went white when she saw him. Samuel knew he must look terrible, pale, exhausted, his shirt stained with blood. Clara dropped the sheet she was holding and ran to him as he dismounted. "Samuel, my God, what happened?" He caught her in his arms and held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, the solid reality of her. "I'll tell you everything," he said. "But first I need you to know I love you. And your grandmother was right about everything. About the spirits, about the guardians, about all of it." Clara pulled back and looked up at him, searching his face. Whatever she saw there made her stop asking questions. She simply nodded and helped him into the house, into warmth and safety, into the world of ordinary things. But as Samuel sat at his own kitchen table, Clara bandaging his hand properly, he found himself wondering how many other places in these mountains held ancient evils sealed away by ancient sacrifices. How many other guardian spirits walked the boundary between worlds, protecting the living from things that should never wake. And he wondered if someday, somewhere else, another desperate fight would be necessary. For now, though, he was home. He was safe. And somewhere up on the mountain, Mary Henderson was safe too. Her baby kicking in her womb, full of life and future, protected by a mother's love that had reached across death itself. That, Samuel thought, was enough. That was worth everything he'd given. Clara set a cup of coffee in front of him, and her hand rested gently on his shoulder. "Rest," she said. "Whatever you fought, it can't reach you here." Samuel hoped she was right. He closed his eyes and let exhaustion take him, drifting into dreamless sleep while Clara kept watch. His own guardian, his own light in the darkness. Samuel woke 3 hours later to find Clara sitting beside the bed, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Fear, relief, wonder, all mixed together in her gray eyes. His left hand throbbed where she'd rebandaged it with proper dressing, clean white cloth wrapped tight. The afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom window, painting everything in warm gold. For a moment, Samuel thought maybe it had all been a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. Then he tried to sit up and felt how hollow his body was, how weak. No dream left you feeling like you'd poured half your blood into the earth. "Tell me," Clara said simply. So Samuel did. He told her everything, from Thomas Whitfield's warning to the impossible tracks to Mary's dreams. He described the ghost wolf, translucent and glowing, and the shadow thing that had flowed down Widow's Peak like living darkness. He told her about cutting his hand, about feeding his life force to the wolf, about watching both creatures disappear into solid stone. Clara listened without interrupting, her hand resting on his arm, her touch anchoring him to reality. When he finished, the room was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "My grandmother told me about the Widow's Peak," Clara said finally. Her voice was soft, distant, as if she was pulling memories from deep water. She said her people avoided it for generations, said there was something sealed there by the ancient ones, something that fed on children before they could be born, stealing futures, consuming possibility. She met Samuel's eyes. She said a woman warrior had gone into the mountain to fight it long ago, gave her life to trap it. But the story said she was still there, still fighting, still protecting. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You met her, Samuel. You helped her finish what she started centuries ago." Samuel felt something tight in his chest loosen. Clara believed him. She understood. "I thought I was going to die up there," he admitted. "When I cut my hand, when I felt my strength draining into that wolf, I thought I'd given too much, that I wouldn't see you again." Clara leaned forward and kissed his forehead, gentle as breath. But you did see me again. You came home. And now that thing is sealed away where it can't hurt anyone else." She paused, then added, "Mary's baby will live because of what you did. That matters, Samuel. That matters more than anything." Over the next 3 days, Samuel's strength returned slowly. He spent most of his time in bed or sitting by the fire, letting Clara tend to him. She made rich bone broth and forced him to drink cup after cup. She changed his bandages twice a day, noting with satisfaction that the cut was healing cleanly. No infection. Neighbors stopped by, and Clara turned them away with vague explanations about Samuel catching a fever on the trail. Only old Thomas Whitfield was allowed inside, and only because he wouldn't take no for an answer. Thomas sat in the chair across from Samuel, rolling one of his cigarettes but not lighting it. "Heard you went up to check on Mary Henderson," he said carefully. "Heard you stayed the night. Everything all right up there?" Samuel studied the old rancher's face, saw the questions Thomas wasn't asking directly. How much did the old man know? How much had he suspected when he rode out to Samuel's fence that day? "Everything's fine now," Samuel said. "Mary's safe. The cabin's secure. Whatever was bothering her cattle is gone." Thomas nodded slowly, turning the unlit cigarette between his fingers. "Funny thing," he said. "Night before last I was lying in bed and I saw this light, coming from the direction of Widow's Peak. Bright as day it was, for maybe 10 seconds. Then it just went out." He finally met Samuel's eyes. "My grandfather told me stories about that mountain. Said the old ones had sealed something evil there. Said sometimes it woke up, and when it did, someone had to go fight it." Thomas stood up, pocketed his cigarette. "I'm glad it was you who went up there, Samuel. I'm glad Mary had someone who'd do what needed doing." After Thomas left, Clara came to sit beside Samuel. "People are going to talk," she said, "about you staying overnight at the Henderson cabin while her husband was away. You know how folks can be." Samuel hadn't thought about that. In the moment, protecting Mary had been the only thing that mattered. But Clara was right. In a small ranching community, appearances mattered. Reputations could be ruined by less. "Jacob Henderson will be back from Denver any day now," Samuel said. "When he arrives, I'll ride up there and explain everything to him face to face." Jacob Henderson rode into town 4 days after Samuel's return. Samuel saw him from the window of the general store, a tall man with a weathered face and kind eyes, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. Samuel intercepted him before he could leave town, falling into step beside his horse. "Mr. Henderson, I need to talk to you about your wife, about Mary." Jacob's face went tight with concern. "Is she all right? The baby?" Samuel quickly reassured him. "She's fine. They're both fine. But some things happened while you were gone, and you need to hear about them from me." They rode together toward the Henderson ranch, Samuel explaining as they went. He told Jacob about the creature circling the cabin, about Mary's fear, about staying to protect her. He left out the supernatural elements. Jacob would hear those from Mary if she chose to share them. But he made sure Jacob understood that Samuel's presence had been necessary and proper, that nothing inappropriate had occurred. Jacob listened in silence, his jaw working as he processed the information. When Samuel finished, Jacob stopped his horse and turned in the saddle to face him. "You stayed to protect my wife and unborn child when they were in danger," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion. "Any man who would fault you for that isn't worth knowing." He extended his hand, and Samuel shook it. "I owe you a debt, Mr. Crow. Mary's everything to me. If something had happened to her—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Samuel understood. "No debt," he said. Any decent man would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. Plenty of men would have found excuses to avoid getting involved, would have decided it wasn't their problem. 3 weeks later, on a cold morning in early November, Jacob Henderson rode down from the line cabin with news. Mary had gone into labor the night before. She'd delivered a healthy baby girl just after dawn. Mother and baby were both doing well. Jacob's face was lit with joy as he shared the news with everyone he met in town. When he reached Samuel and Clara's ranch, he dismounted and pulled a small cloth bundle from his saddlebag. "Mary wanted you to have this," he said, handing it to Samuel. "She said you'd understand." Samuel unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a small wooden carving, clearly handmade. It depicted a wolf sitting on its haunches, head raised as if howling at the moon. The craftsmanship was rough but earnest, made with love rather than skill. A piece of paper was tucked beneath it, folded small. Samuel opened it and read Mary's neat handwriting. Her name is Hope Clara Henderson, born November 8, 1881. She has her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn spirit, and she lives because a cowboy was brave enough to fight shadows. Thank you will never be enough. But thank you anyway. The wolf watches over her still. Some nights I see it in my dreams, standing guard. I'm not afraid anymore. Clara read the note over Samuel's shoulder, and he heard her breath catch. She took the wooden wolf from his hands and held it up to the light, examining it closely. This is sacred, she said quietly. Mary carved this herself, poured her gratitude and protection into every cut of the knife. This isn't just a gift, Samuel. It's a talisman, a reminder that love can reach beyond death, that sacrifice matters. She placed it on the mantel above their fireplace, where it would catch the light each morning. It belongs here, where we can see it every day. Winter came early that year, snow falling heavy in the mountains by mid-November. Samuel recovered fully, his hand healing to nothing more than a pale scar across his palm. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howled down from the peaks, he'd wake and find himself staring at that scar, remembering the weight of the wolf's fur under his bleeding hand, remembering the way light had exploded from Widow's Peak, remembering Mary's terrified face in the lamplight and the shadow thing's hunger. He developed a habit of walking outside on those restless nights, standing in his yard and looking toward the mountains. Clara never questioned it. She'd wake when he left the bed, and she'd wait, knowing he'd come back when he was ready. Sometimes she'd find him standing in the snow in just his nightshirt and boots, staring at the dark peaks against the stars. Once she asked him what he was looking for. Making sure it stays sealed, he said. Making sure the light doesn't come back. Clara understood. Some fears don't fade just because the danger has passed. Christmas came, and with it a package from the Hendersons. Inside was a photograph, new technology that was just becoming affordable for regular folks. It showed Mary sitting in a chair, holding baby Hope in her arms. Jacob stood behind them, one hand on Mary's shoulder. The baby was tiny, wrapped in white blankets, her face peaceful in sleep. But it was Mary's expression that caught Samuel's attention. She looked at peace. The haunted quality that had shadowed her eyes in the cabin was gone. She looked like a woman who'd been to hell and walked back out, stronger for the journey. A letter accompanied the photo. Jacob's handwriting this time, blocky and practical. Mary wants you to know that Hope is thriving. Strong lungs, healthy appetite, growing like a weed. We moved down from the line cabin permanently. Couldn't stay there after everything that happened. The cabin serves as storage now, nothing more. Some places hold too many memories. But we're well. The ranch is doing good. And every night, before we put Hope to bed, Mary tells her a story about a brave cowboy and a guardian wolf. She's too young to understand now, but someday she will, and she'll know what she owes to you. Spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the meadows green. Samuel's ranch prospered. His cattle were healthy, his fences strong. Life moved forward in its ordinary rhythms, planting, growing, harvesting. But Samuel found that he looked at the world differently now. He noticed things he'd missed before. The way morning light caught in spider webs, making them shine like the wolf's translucent fur. The way shadows moved at twilight, and how sometimes they seemed to have weight and purpose. He'd glimpsed something beyond the veil of normal reality, and he couldn't unsee it. Clara became pregnant that spring. When she told Samuel, he felt joy mixed with a spike of fear he couldn't explain. He found himself watching her more carefully, listening for sounds in the night, checking the doors and windows before bed. Clara noticed, of course. She always noticed. "I'm not Mary Henderson," she said gently. "And this isn't Widow's Peak. Whatever darkness was up there, you sealed it away. Our baby is safe." Samuel wanted to believe her, tried to believe her. But some nights he'd wake with his heart pounding, certain he'd heard that wrong, almost human cry echoing across the valley. One evening in early summer, Samuel rode up to Widow's Peak. Not to the Henderson cabin, but to the base of the mountain itself, where the wolf and the shadow thing had disappeared into stone. He needed to see it again, to confirm that the ceiling had held. The forest was green and alive now, birds singing in the branches, squirrels chattering at his passage. No unnatural silence, no sense of being watched. The mountain was just a mountain again, beautiful and indifferent. He found the spot where the wolf had dragged the shadow thing into the rock face. The stone showed no mark, no crack, no indication that anything unusual had occurred there. But when Samuel placed his scarred palm against the granite, he felt something. A warmth, a presence. Not threatening, protective. The wolf was still there, he realized. Still standing guard. Still keeping the darkness sealed away. "Thank you," Samuel whispered to the stone, "for saving her, for saving hope, for fighting when you could have rested." The wind sighed through the pines, and for just a moment Samuel thought he heard a response, a low, gentle sound that might have been a wolf's acknowledgement. He rode home as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Clara met him in the yard, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. Samuel dismounted and kissed her, tasting the sweetness of the water she'd been drinking. "Yes," he said. "It's still there. Still protecting. We're safe." Clara smiled, the kind of smile that held both knowledge and peace. "I know," she said. "I've known since the night you came home. Some battles end, but the guardians never stop watching." That night, lying in bed with Clara curled against him, Samuel thought about all the stories that would never be told. How many people had lived and died in these mountains, never knowing about the ancient evil sealed beneath Widow's Peak? How many pregnant women had stayed too long near that cursed place, drawn by its call, only to disappear into legend? And how many times had the wolf spirit fought, failed, tried again? For centuries, Mary had said. Centuries of fighting, waiting, hoping for the moment when she'd have help enough to seal the darkness away forever. In September, Clara went into labor. Samuel paced outside the bedroom while the midwife and her assistant worked inside. Every sound made his heart race, every cry from Clara, every urgent voice from the midwife. He thought about Mary Henderson going through this alone in that isolated cabin, 8 months pregnant with a shadow thing calling to her from the mountain. He thought about the wolf, standing guard through 3 long nights. And he prayed, to God, to the spirits, to whatever forces governed the boundary between worlds, that his child would be born healthy and whole. When the midwife finally called him in, Samuel entered the room on shaking legs. Clara lay propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. "It's a boy," the midwife announced with satisfaction. "Strong and healthy. Good lungs." Samuel approached slowly, as if walking through a dream. Clara pulled back the cloth so he could see their son's face, red and wrinkled, eyes squeezed shut, mouth open in a cry of protest at being thrust into the cold world. Samuel felt something crack open in his chest, a love so fierce it almost hurt. "What should we name him?" Clara asked, her voice tired but content. Samuel thought about old Thomas Whitfield, who'd warned him in time, about Jacob Henderson, who'd trusted him, about the wolf spirit, who'd fought for centuries and finally found peace. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Jacob Crow." Clara smiled and nodded. "Good names, strong names, names with meaning." She looked down at their son, who'd stopped crying and was now making small, snuffling sounds. "Welcome to the world, Thomas Jacob. Your father is a hero, though he'd never call himself that. And you're going to grow up knowing that courage means doing what's right even when it terrifies you." The seasons turned. Thomas grew from infant to toddler, sturdy and fearless. Hope Henderson turned 1, then 2, growing into a bright-eyed child who laughed easily and showed no fear of the dark. The two families stayed close, bound by shared secrets and mutual respect. Sometimes, on warm summer evenings, the Hendersons would ride down to visit, and the children would play in the yard while the adults sat on the porch, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. Mary and Samuel rarely spoke directly about that night, but sometimes their eyes would meet, and a whole conversation would pass in silence, a recognition of what they'd survived together, an acknowledgement of the impossible thing they'd witnessed, a shared understanding that some truths were too strange to speak aloud, but no less real for their strangeness. Jacob and Clara understood in their own way, accepted the shadows in their spouse's eyes, as the price of having faced something beyond normal experience. Years passed. Samuel's scar faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. The wooden wolf on the mantel aged and darkened, its features worn smooth by time and the occasional dusting, but it remained there, a silent guardian, a reminder carved in wood of a greater guardian carved from spirit and sacrifice. Sometimes Thomas would ask about it, and Samuel would tell him it was a gift from a friend. When Thomas was older, Samuel promised himself he'd tell the boy the whole truth, but not yet. Some stories needed the listener to be ready. On quiet nights, when the moon was bright and the mountains stood clear against the stars, Samuel would sometimes walk out into his yard and look toward Widow's Peak. The mountain was just a mountain, beautiful and permanent, keeper of secrets that would never be fully told. But Samuel knew what lay sealed within its stone heart, and he knew that somewhere in the boundary between worlds, a guardian wolf still stood watch, protecting the living from darkness that should never wake. He thought about all the people going about their ordinary lives, never knowing how close they lived to ancient evils, never suspecting the battles fought in shadows to keep them safe. How many times had humanity been saved by guardians they never saw, by sacrifices they never knew were made? The world was thinner than most people realized, the wall between normal and impossible more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. But it held, because of spirits like the wolf, because of people like Mary, who'd faced her terror and refused to surrender, because of ordinary men who became heroes when the moment demanded it. Clara came out to join him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill. She slipped her hand into his, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the mountains and the stars. From inside the house came the sound of Thomas singing himself to sleep, his young voice sweet and off-key. Life continued. Children grew. Seasons changed. And somewhere, sealed in stone, an ancient evil slept behind a guardian's eternal vigilance. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked quietly. "Going up there that night? Nearly dying?" Samuel thought about the question, really considered it. He thought about the fear, the pain, the sight of his own blood running black in the moonlight. He thought about the hollow feeling of having given too much, of nearly not coming home. Then he thought about Hope Henderson's photograph, her peaceful sleeping face, the life she was living because he'd been brave for one night. "No," he said. "I don't regret it. Not for a second." Clara squeezed his hand. "Good," she said, "because that night, when you chose to ride up that mountain, when you chose to stay and fight, that's when I knew for certain that I'd married the right man. Not because you're fearless, but because you did it anyway." They walked back inside together, to warmth and light, to their son's breathing and the tick of the mantel clock, to the ordinary, precious, hard-won peace of home. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night and the mountains and the secrets they held. But on the mantel, the wooden wolf stood watch as it always would, a reminder that love persists beyond death, that courage means acting despite fear, that mothers, whether of flesh or spirit, will fight the darkness to protect their children, and that sometimes ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things, and they rise to the challenge, and the world continues, never knowing how close it came to falling into shadow. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it will always be. And somewhere in the thin places between worlds, guardians stand watch, waiting for the moment when they're needed again. Sometimes second chances come from the most unexpected places, from guardians we never knew were watching over us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to drop in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing which corner of this great country my stories reach. Subscribe for more tales like this, stories about courage, sacrifice, and the thin line between the world we see and the world that watches over us.